They thought seeing me alone was the most humiliating thing that could happen. They had no idea what was coming next. My name is Sophia Chen, and at 28, I'd become the family's favorite cautionary tale. You know the type: successful career, nice apartment, everything together except for that one glaring detail that made every family gathering feel like a court trial. No ring on my finger, no +1 to bring to events, no romantic success story to share over holiday dinners. "Sophia's still figuring things out," my mother would say with that sympathetic smile that made my skin crawl. "She's so focused on work, you know. Some people just bloom later." Bloom later, as if I were some delayed houseplant instead of a grown woman who'd built a 6-figure career in project management. As if my worth was measured entirely by whether someone had chosen to put a ring on my finger. The pattern started years ago, but it had gotten worse since Isabella announced her engagement. Every phone call home began with updates about wedding planning, followed by the inevitable question, "So, are you bringing anyone to the wedding?" The question always came with this hopeful lilt, as if this time, I might surprise them. "I'll let you know, Mom," became my standard response. What I really wanted to say was that I'd rather show up alone than bring some random guy just to satisfy their need for me to appear normal. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in their 20s with nothing but determination and a dream of the perfect American family. They'd worked 70-hour weeks, saved every penny, and built a comfortable middle-class life in suburban Connecticut. Their American dream included 2 daughters who would marry well, give them grandchildren, and prove that their sacrifices had been worth it. Isabella had delivered on that dream in spectacular fashion. I'd become the glitch in their perfect narrative. The thing is, I hadn't always been the disappointing daughter. In high school, I'd been the reliable one. Straight A's, academic scholarships, the daughter they bragged about to their friends. Isabella had been the wild child, the one they worried about. But somewhere in my 20s, the script flipped. Isabella's rebellious phase evolved into magnetic charm that drew people to her like moths to a flame. My reliability became boring. My independence became loneliness. "You're too picky," Dad would say during our monthly dinners. "You can't expect perfection, Sophia. Sometimes you have to compromise." Compromise. The word that had haunted every relationship I'd ever attempted. Compromise when he didn't want to hear about my promotion. Compromise when he made plans without consulting me. Compromise when his idea of a romantic evening was splitting the bill at Applebee's and expecting me to be grateful for the attention. I'd learned that being alone was infinitely better than compromising myself into someone I didn't recognize. But try explaining that to a family obsessed with the appearance of happiness over actual happiness. The worst part wasn't the constant questions or the pitying looks. It was the way they'd started treating me like a charity case. Last Christmas, Aunt Helen had actually tried to set me up with her neighbor's recently divorced son. "He's got kids, but they're sweet," she'd whispered conspiratorially. "And he's not picky about age." Not picky about age. At 28. That's when I realized they'd written me off entirely. In their minds, I was no longer a catch to be proud of. I was damaged goods who should be grateful for whatever scraps of male attention came my way. But nothing compared to what was happening now with Isabella's wedding. Isabella Chen had always been beautiful, but at 25, she'd somehow become luminescent. Where I had our father's practical features and our mother's serious demeanor, Isabella had inherited the best of both worlds and added her own magic touch. Men orbited around her like planets around the sun, and she basked in the attention like she'd been born for it. 2 years ago, she'd met Marcus Wellington at a charity gala. Marcus was everything our parents had dreamed of: handsome, successful, from a family whose name appeared on buildings around the city. Within 6 months, he'd proposed with a ring that cost more than my car. "Isabella's really found her place in the world," Mom would say, showing everyone the engagement photos for the 100th time. "Marcus comes from such a good family. They have houses in the Hamptons and Aspen." The transformation in Isabella had been swift and dramatic. Gone was the little sister who used to borrow my clothes and ask for relationship advice. In her place was someone who spoke in hushed tones about the wedding planner and the venue coordinator, as if they were heads of state. "You'll understand when you find someone worthy of this kind of celebration," she'd said to me just last month, gesturing at the mountain of wedding planning materials spread across Mom's dining room table. "Some people are meant for simple ceremonies, others," she'd shrugged, letting the implication hang in the air. The guest list had become a source of particular tension. Every conversation about the wedding somehow circled back to my +1 situation. "Maybe you could ask that guy from your gym," Isabella had suggested with false brightness. "What was his name? David? Daniel?" "Derek. And he's married." "Oh." She'd paused, clearly searching for another option. "What about someone from work?" "I'm not bringing a random coworker to your wedding, Isabella. I'm just trying to help, Sophia. I know how awkward it can be to show up to these things alone." These things. As if weddings were some exclusive club that only couples could properly appreciate. The final straw had come during the rehearsal dinner planning. Isabella had been going over seating arrangements when she'd casually mentioned that I'd be at table 12. "Table 12?" I'd asked. "Where's that?" "Near the back, with Aunt Martha and the other unattached relatives." The other unattached relatives. A collection of divorced aunts and never-married cousins who would spend the evening comparing notes on why men today weren't like they used to be. "You could put me with your college friends?" I'd suggested. "They're all couples, Sophia. It would be weird." Weird. My presence would be weird because I didn't come with a matching accessory. That's when I'd realized that somewhere along the way, Isabella had stopped seeing me as her sister and started seeing me as an embarrassment. The successful, independent woman I'd worked so hard to become was, in her eyes, just a lonely spinster who might bring down the sophisticated atmosphere she was trying to create. The week before the wedding, things had gotten even worse. Isabella had called to prepare me for the guest list. "Just so you know, practically everyone will be there with dates," she'd said, her voice taking on that fake, concerned tone that made my teeth itch. "I don't want you to feel out of place." "I'll be fine, Isabella. I know you will. You're so strong. So independent." The way she said independent made it sound like a terminal illness. "I just think maybe this time you should consider bringing someone. Anyone. Even just as a friend." "Are you asking me to hire an escort for your wedding?" "Don't be dramatic, Sophia. I'm asking you to make an effort. This is the most important day of my life, and I don't want anything to overshadow it." Anything. I was an anything that might overshadow her perfect day. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn clarity that seemed specifically designed to mock my mood. I'd spent an hour getting ready, choosing a navy blue dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing, sophisticated but not trying too hard. The kind of dress a successful single woman would wear to prove she was perfectly fine with her life choices. I wasn't perfectly fine, but I'd learned to play the part. The venue was everything Isabella had dreamed of, a sprawling estate in Greenwich with manicured gardens and the kind of understated elegance that whispered old money. Cars lined the circular driveway, and I could see couples walking arm in arm toward the entrance, the women's dresses floating like butterflies in the gentle breeze. I sat in my car for a moment, watching them. Everyone seemed to exist in pairs, as if Noah himself had arranged the guest list. For a wild moment, I considered just driving away. I could send a text later about sudden illness, flowers, and apologies to follow. But I was Sophia Chen, and Sophia Chen didn't run away from things. Even when those things felt like walking into a battlefield armed with nothing but pride and a really good handbag. The walk from the parking area to the entrance felt eternal. I could sense eyes tracking my movement, see the subtle nudges as people noticed me approaching alone. By the time I reached the doors, my jaw ached from maintaining my serene smile. The ceremony space was breathtaking, cream and gold everything, flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and enough ambient lighting to make everyone look like they belonged in a fairy tale. I found my seat in the back section, nodding politely at the collection of unattached relatives who would be my companions for the evening. Isabella looked radiant, of course. Marcus looked appropriately smitten. The ceremony was picture perfect, the kind of wedding that would generate magazine-worthy photos and envious social media comments. I managed to keep my composure through the vows, through the recessional, through the cocktail hour where people kept asking if I was here with someone in that carefully casual way that fooled no one. But it was during the reception entrance that things took their inevitable turn for the worse. The MC, a friend of Marcus's with the kind of practiced charm that came from years of country club events, was introducing the wedding party. Each couple was announced with flourishes about their relationships, their accomplishments, their beautiful partnership. Then he got to the family tables. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Chen family, David and Linda, proud parents of our beautiful bride, and their daughter Sophia, who continues to focus on building her impressive career. The pause after impressive career was subtle but unmistakable. It was the pause of pity, the one that said, "Bless her heart, she's trying so hard to make up for what she's missing." I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck. Around me, tables full of couples smiled sympathetically, and I knew exactly what they were thinking. Poor Sophia, still alone, still trying to convince everyone she's happy about it. Isabella was beaming at the head table, surrounded by her bridesmaids and their various partners. She caught my eye and gave me a little wave that somehow managed to be both loving and condescending at the same time. That's when I heard it, the whisper that would replay in my mind for hours afterward. "She couldn't even find a date," Isabella was saying to her maid of honor, her voice carrying just far enough for several nearby tables to hear. "I mean, I love my sister, but at some point, you have to wonder what's wrong with the way she approaches relationships." The maid of honor murmured something sympathetic, and Isabella continued, "I tried to help her find someone to bring, but she's so stubborn. She thinks she's too good for compromise." Too good for compromise, as if wanting to be treated with basic respect was some character flaw that prevented me from finding happiness. I felt something inside me snap, not break, snap, like a rubber band stretched too far, too fast. I was done. Done with the pitying looks, done with the careful questions, done with being treated like a problem to be solved or a cautionary tale to be whispered about. I was especially done with my little sister treating me like an embarrassment to be managed. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. Several people turned to look at me, their expressions curious and slightly concerned. This was it. This was the moment I'd either salvage what was left of my dignity or completely humiliate myself in front of everyone who mattered to my family. I was 2 steps toward the exit when it happened. The double doors at the entrance burst open with a force that sent them banging against the walls. Every head in the room turned toward the sound, conversations dying mid-sentence as if someone had hit a pause button on the entire reception. A man stepped through the doorway, and even from across the room, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't someone making a late entrance. This was someone making an entrance, period. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked artfully disheveled and a face that belonged on magazine covers. But it wasn't his looks that commanded the room's attention. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that came from knowing you were the most important person in any room you entered. His suit was perfectly tailored, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his Italian leather shoes to the watch that caught the light as he moved. But what stopped me cold wasn't his appearance. It was the way his eyes swept the room and landed directly on me. Without hesitation, without even acknowledging the hundreds of people staring at him, he began walking straight toward my table. His stride was purposeful, determined, like he'd been planning this moment for years. The room had gone completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every single gaze switching between this mysterious man and me. At the head table, I saw Isabella's mouth fall open, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. He didn't stop walking until he was standing right beside my chair. Then, in a voice that carried just enough for the nearby tables to hear, but somehow felt intimate and private, he said the words that would change everything. Sorry I'm late, love. Before I could process what was happening, he reached for my hand and lifted it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned, romantic, and completely devastating in its effect on the room. I hope I haven't missed too much, he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. Traffic from the airport was murder. His accent was subtle but definitely there, something that suggested expensive educations and international business dealings. Everything about him radiated the kind of success that made men envious and women interested, and he was talking to me like we'd been together forever. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. This had to be a mistake. He had to have me confused with someone else. People like him didn't just appear in my life and call me love, but he was already moving, smoothly pulling out the empty chair beside me and settling into it as if he belonged there, as if he'd always belonged there. Alexander Romano, he said, extending his hand to the confused-looking relatives at my table. Sophia's told me so much about all of you. Alexander Romano. The name hit the room like a shockwave. I saw Marcus's father actually choke on his drink, saw Isabella's new mother-in-law grab her husband's arm with white knuckles, because everyone in this room knew that name. Alexander Romano, the tech billionaire who'd revolutionized data analytics before he was 30. Alexander Romano, whose company had just gone public in the biggest IPO of the year. Alexander Romano, who'd been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine just last month. And apparently, according to him, I was his love. The story of how Alexander Romano came to be sitting beside me at my sister's wedding, calling me love in front of 300 guests, began 3 years ago in a cramped conference room that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. I was 25 then, working as a project manager for a small tech startup called Data Flow Solutions. We were developing predictive analytics software for healthcare systems, revolutionary in theory, but we were burning through funding faster than we could prove our concept. The company was 6 months away from bankruptcy when our CEO announced we had a potential investor coming in for a final presentation. This is it, Mark Henderson, our perpetually stressed founder, had told the team. We get this investment, or we all start updating our resumes. I'd spent 2 weeks preparing for that presentation, knowing that my entire team's livelihood depended on it. The software was solid, I believed in it completely, but we'd struggled to communicate its value to previous investors. Too technical for the business people, too business-focused for the tech experts. I'd finally figured out how to bridge that gap. The morning of the presentation, Mark was pacing the conference room like a caged animal. "He's here," he'd announced after getting a text from reception. "Alexander Romano. Try not to stare when he walks in. The guy's intimidating as hell." I'd heard the name, of course. Everyone in tech had. Romano had built his first company at 22 and sold it for $50 million. His second company had gone public and made him a billionaire before 30. Now he invested in startups, but he was notoriously selective. Out of hundreds of pitches, he might fund 2 or 3 companies per year. When he walked into our conference room, I understood immediately why Mark had warned us about staring. Alexander Romano commanded attention without trying. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 32, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of a room in seconds. He'd worn a simple black sweater and dark jeans, but something about the way they fit suggested they'd cost more than my monthly rent. No flashy jewelry, no obvious displays of wealth, but you could practically feel the power radiating from him. "Ms. Chen," he'd said, reading from the brief Mark had prepared. "I understand you're the one who's going to convince me your software is worth my time." His directness should have been intimidating, but instead, it was refreshing. No small talk, no pretense, just straight to business. For the next hour, I'd walked him through every aspect of our platform, how it could predict patient readmission rates with 93% accuracy, how it could optimize hospital staffing schedules and reduce costs by up to 40%, how it could literally save lives by identifying at-risk patients before crises occurred. But more importantly, I'd explained why I believed in it, how my grandmother had died from complications that might have been prevented with better predictive care, How healthcare systems were drowning in data but starving for insights. How our software could be the bridge between human intuition and artificial intelligence. Alexander had asked questions, technical ones that proved he understood our code, business ones that showed he grasped our market position, philosophical ones that revealed he cared about more than just profit margins. The healthcare industry is notoriously slow to adopt new technology, he'd said at one point. How do you plan to overcome that resistance? By proving we can save lives, I'd answered without hesitation. Money talks, but dead patients talk louder. Once we demonstrate real outcomes, the resistance becomes irrelevant. Something had shifted in his expression then, a spark of what might have been respect, or maybe just interest. But I'd felt it, that moment when a conversation stops being a presentation and becomes a connection. He'd funded us. $20 million, with the option for more as we hit development milestones. But more than that, he'd insisted on being actively involved in the company's growth. For the next 2 years, Alexander had been a constant presence in our work. Not micromanaging, he was too smart for that, but available whenever we needed guidance. He'd attend our quarterly reviews, offer strategic advice, and somehow always know exactly what questions to ask to keep us focused on what mattered. Working with him had been unlike anything I'd experienced. He had this way of seeing 3 moves ahead in every situation, of finding solutions that seemed obvious only after he'd pointed them out. But he never made you feel stupid for not seeing them yourself. Instead, he'd guide you to the answer, letting you think you discovered it on your own. You have excellent instincts, he'd told me after a particularly challenging presentation to potential hospital partners. You just need to trust them more. Somewhere during those 2 years, my professional admiration had evolved into something more complicated. It wasn't just his intelligence or his success that drew me to him. It was the way he listened when people talked, really listened, as if their words were the most important thing he'd hear all day. It was how he remembered details about his employees' lives, asking about sick relatives, celebrating promotions, knowing everyone's coffee preferences. He was kind without being soft, brilliant without being condescending, powerful without being arrogant. Everything I'd thought I wanted in a partner, wrapped up in a package that was completely, impossibly out of my league. I'd convinced myself that the attraction was one-sided. Men like Alexander Romano dated supermodels and socialites, not small-town project managers who still shopped at Target. The few times I'd caught him looking at me with something that might have been more than professional interest, I'd told myself I was imagining it. The end had come suddenly. Dataflow Solutions was acquired by a major healthcare conglomerate for $200 million. Alexander's investment had paid off spectacularly, and everyone on our team had received life-changing bonuses. It should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral. I'll be going back to Europe for a while, Alexander had told me during our final meeting. There are some opportunities there that need my attention. For how long? I'd asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Indefinitely. He'd paused, and for a moment, I'd thought he was going to say something else. Something personal. But then he'd simply extended his hand for a professional handshake. It's been a pleasure working with you, Sophia. I hope you know how remarkable you are. Remarkable. The word had echoed in my head for weeks afterward. I'd thrown myself into my next job, determined to prove that I could succeed without Alexander's guidance. But nothing had felt quite the same. Other bosses were either micromanagers or completely absent. Other projects lacked the sense of purpose that had driven our healthcare work. Other men weren't Alexander Romano. I'd followed his career from a distance, reading about his investments in renewable energy and educational technology. He'd appeared on magazine covers, been featured in documentaries about successful entrepreneurs, given speeches at international conferences. Each article had felt like glimpsing someone from another world. Someone who'd briefly intersected with my life but had always been destined for bigger things. What I hadn't known was that he'd been following my career too. After Dataflow Solutions, I'd moved to a larger consulting firm where I specialized in helping tech companies scale their operations. I was good at it. good enough to build a reputation in the industry, good enough to be featured in a few trade publications, good enough to speak at conferences myself. Apparently, good enough to stay on Alexander Romano's radar. The plan, as he explained it to me now in whispered conversations between wedding reception formalities, had been months in the making. "I saw the wedding announcement on your LinkedIn," he admitted, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Isabella Chen marrying Marcus Wellington. It wasn't hard to figure out the family connection." "You've been stalking my LinkedIn?" I asked, trying to process the impossibility of the situation. "I've been hoping to find an excuse to contact you for 3 years, he corrected. "When I saw that post about attending your sister's wedding, I knew this was my chance." "Huh, your chance to what?" "To apologize for leaving without saying goodbye properly. To tell you that walking away from you was the stupidest business decision I ever made." His eyes met mine across the table, and the intensity there made my breath catch. "To find out if you'd be willing to give me another chance." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's father, Richard Wellington, approaching our table with the kind of forced, casual manner that screamed panic. "Alexander! What a wonderful surprise to see you here." Richard's smile was so tight it looked painful. "I had no idea you were connected to the Chen family." Alexander stood smoothly, extending his hand for a shake that somehow managed to be both polite and commanding. "Richard, beautiful ceremony. You must be very proud." "Absolutely. Marcus chose well." Richard's eyes darted to me, clearly trying to piece together the relationship dynamic. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting your companion." "Sophia Chen," Alexander said, and the pride in his voice as he said my name sent warmth spreading through my chest. "She's the brilliant woman behind the Data Flow Solutions success story, and the reason I'm here tonight." I watched Richard's expression shift as he processed this information. Data Flow Solutions had been major news in business circles when it was acquired, the kind of success story that got written up in Harvard Business Review and cited in investment strategy papers. "Of course," Richard said, his tone changing entirely. "Ms. Chen, it's an honor. We've followed your career with great interest." "We," meaning the Wellington family's investment firm, which had probably kicked themselves for missing out on Dataflow's early funding rounds. "Alexander speaks very highly of your strategic insights," Richard continued. "Perhaps we could arrange a meeting next week. We're always looking for consultants with your expertise." It was fascinating to watch how quickly Richard's opinion of me had shifted. 10 minutes ago, I'd been the unfortunate single sister who couldn't find a date. Now, suddenly, I was a strategic asset worth courting. "I'm sure Sophia would be happy to consider it," Alexander said smoothly, "though her schedule is quite packed these days." After Richard retreated, Alexander turned back to me with an expression that was part amusement, part satisfaction. "You planned this," I said, the pieces finally clicking together. "You knew exactly what would happen when you walked in here." "I hoped," he corrected. "But I wasn't certain until I saw your face when I sat down. You could have told everyone I was crazy and had me escorted out." The thought crossed my mind. "But you didn't, which tells me that maybe, just maybe, you've missed me as much as I've missed you." Before I could respond, the MC was calling for everyone's attention for the toasts. Isabella's maid of honor went first, sharing stories about childhood dreams of perfect weddings. Marcus's best man followed with tales of bachelor party adventures and sealed deal golf games. Then Marcus's father stood up, clearly intending to give the final toast. But Alexander was already rising from his chair, champagne glass in hand. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room without seeming like he was shouting. "I'd like to say something about the Chen family." The room went silent. This wasn't part of the planned program, but when a billionaire asks to speak at your wedding, you don't say no. "I've had the privilege of working with some extraordinary people throughout my career," Alexander began, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. "But I've rarely met someone who combines brilliance with compassion, strategy with heart, the way Sophia Chen does." My face was burning. Every eye in the room was on me, and I could see Isabella's expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been panic. The work we did together changed not just my company's trajectory, but my understanding of what's possible when you find the right partner. He raised his glass toward me. Someone who challenges you to be better, who sees solutions where others see problems, who never compromises her principles even when it would be easier. The word partner hung in the air like a promise, or maybe a declaration. So here's to Isabella and Marcus, he continued, finally acknowledging the actual wedding couple. May your marriage be built on the same kind of partnership, one where both people make each other stronger, where both people are valued for exactly who they are. He sat down to a round of applause that seemed more confused than enthusiastic. But I barely heard it. All I could focus on was the way he'd looked at me when he'd said, partner. Like he wasn't just talking about business. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of surreal moments. People kept approaching our table, ostensibly to congratulate Isabella and Marcus, but really to get introduced to Alexander. My parents appeared at one point, my mother's smile so bright it could have powered the entire venue. Sophia, darling, why didn't you tell us Alexander was coming? Mom gushed, as if I'd been hiding a secret boyfriend rather than being as surprised as everyone else. It was meant to be a surprise, Alexander said smoothly, saving me from having to explain something I didn't understand myself. Dad was practically vibrating with excitement. We'd love to have you over for dinner sometime, Alexander. Sophia's mother makes the most incredible dumplings. I'd be honored, Alexander replied. Sophia's told me so much about your family. Which was a complete lie, since I'd barely mentioned my family during our professional relationship. But watching my parents' faces light up with pride in me for the first time in years, I found I didn't care about the deception. Isabella finally made her way over during a break in the dancing, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves as she approached our table. Her smile was perfectly in place, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Alexander, it's so wonderful to meet you, she said, extending her hand with practiced grace. I'm Isabella, Sophia's sister. I can't believe she's been hiding you from us. I've been traveling extensively, Alexander replied, taking her hand briefly before releasing it. But I wouldn't miss celebrating Sophia's family. Of course. Isabella's smile never wavered, but I caught the slight tightness around her eyes. Sophia's always been so private about her personal life. We were starting to worry she'd never settle down. The word settle hung in the air like a challenge, as if finding someone like Alexander was settling for me, rather than the impossible dream come true. It actually was. I don't think Sophia's the type to settle for anything less than extraordinary, Alexander said, his tone mild but with an edge that made Isabella take a small step back. It's one of the things I admire most about her. After Isabella retreated, Alexander turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She's exactly what I expected, he said quietly. And what's that? Someone who's never had to fight for anything in her life. Someone who can't imagine that other people might see value where she sees flaws. His hand found mine under the table, and his touch sent electricity racing up my arm. Someone who has no idea how remarkable her sister actually is. The evening was winding down when Alexander asked me to dance. The band was playing something slow and romantic, and most of the couples had already claimed space on the dance floor. I should warn you, I said as he led me toward the music. I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I, he admitted. But I've wanted to hold you for 3 years. I'm not wasting this opportunity because of a lack of choreography skills. His arms settled around me like they belonged there, and suddenly the whole room seemed to fade away. There was just the music, just his hands warm against my back, just the way he smelled like expensive cologne and something indefinably masculine. This is insane, I whispered against his shoulder. 6 hours ago, I thought I'd never see you again. Now you're here, pretending to be my boyfriend, dancing with me at my sister's wedding. I'm not pretending anything, he said, his voice rumbling in his chest. And I'm hoping by the end of this dance I won't be pretending to be your boyfriend either. I pulled back to look at him, searching his face for signs that this was all some elaborate joke, but his expression was completely serious. Alexander, I know this is sudden. I know it probably seems crazy, but I've spent 3 years trying to convince myself that what I felt for you was just professional admiration. It didn't work. His hand moved to cup my cheek, and I leaned into the touch despite myself. I've dated other women. Beautiful women, successful women, women who should have been perfect on paper. But none of them were you. You barely know me outside of work, I protested weakly. I know you stay late to help struggling team members even when you don't have to. I know you cry during commercials about rescue animals. I know you take your coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream. I know you hum when you're concentrating, and you always tuck your hair behind your left ear when you're nervous. His thumb traced across my cheekbone. I know you're the strongest person I've ever met, and the kindest, and the smartest, and I know I've been an idiot for waiting 3 years to tell you how I feel. The song was ending, but neither of us moved to leave the dance floor. Around us, other couples were heading back to their tables, but we stayed frozen in this moment that felt too precious to break. What happens now? I asked, because someone had to be practical, and apparently it was going to be me. Now, he said, I take you home. We talk properly without an audience, and you decide whether you're willing to take a chance on something that terrifies me more than any business deal I've ever made. I should have said no, should have pointed out all the reasons this was a bad idea. The distance between our worlds, the fact that he could have anyone he wanted, the way my family would never let me live it down if this didn't work out. Instead, I found myself nodding. Okay, I whispered. Let's go talk. As we left the reception, I caught sight of Isabella watching us from the head table. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. Tomorrow, she'd probably have 1,000 questions about Alexander and our relationship and how long I'd been hiding him. Tomorrow, I'd figure out how to answer them. Tonight, I was going home with the man who'd just turned my entire world upside down. The man who'd seen me as remarkable when my own family saw me as a problem to be solved. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what anyone else thought.